A recent study published in the British Medical Journal just came out, and this study was analyzing fish oil and the risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, I want to point a few things out because the researchers said that their conclusion in this research study was that regular use of fish oil supplements might be a risk for atrial fibrillation and stroke among the general population. In essence, they're trying to warn people away from using omega-3 fish oil supplements. Now, what is the basis for this research study? What's the premise? Why are they making this recommendation? And how did they come to this conclusion? Well, the first thing I think it's important to understand is that this is a prospective cohort study. What they actually did is they used a questionnaire. So they asked questions and they asked people to report on how much fish oil they were taking. Now, they did do a little bit of, in their questionnaire, they asked, for example, who smoked and who was on other types of cardiovascular medications. They asked about gender and age, just to try to rule out some other variable factors. But what they didn't do is they didn't report dosing or type of fish oil. They didn't report the concentration of EPA, which is a type of omega-3, versus DHA, which is another type of omega-3. They didn't do preliminary blood work, so they didn't test these people's levels of omega-3. So they didn't test them. And they were able to draw the conclusion from not doing any of these things that fish oil might increase the risk for atrial fibrillation and stroke, which I find very, very impossible to do. This study, in my opinion, is junk science. It should never have been published in a major journal, because all it really does is it serves to create fear porn for those of you who are trying to take fish oil and to improve your health. Now, what we know about omega-3s in the U.S. is that the average person eats less than 100 milligrams a day of omega-3. And generally the recommendation is 500 or more. So we're sitting at 100 versus 500 as a general recommendation for good health. What we also know in the U.S. is that the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is equal to 16 to 1, when our ancestors, our hunter-gatherer ancestors, had a ratio of 1. And ideally, for any remote type of good health as it relates to cardiovascular disease, the ratio should be no less than 4 to 1. And this is omega-6 to omega-3s, but ideally it should be 1 to 1. And so again, what they're doing in this study is they're using quizzes, asking people to report how much fish oil they're taking without ascertaining the quality of the fish oil, whether it was rancid, whether it was tested for heavy metals, whether it was a good product or whether it was a poor product, what concentration doses were in the fish oil. They didn't do any kind of baseline testing to measure whether or not a person was low in fish oil or low in omega-3 or not low in omega-3, yet they're still making the conclusion and the warning that people should potentially not use fish oil supplements as a result of an increased risk of stroke and atrial fibrillation. Again, can't do that. Now, if we look a little bit closer into this study, I want to just point something out. Look who funded it. Just going to circle that. Look who funded the study. Now, without saying too much about that group, we already saw the chaos that was wreaked here in the last 5 years or so, based on a lot of the work that foundation has done. And here now they're trying to scare us away from something that could potentially be life-saving. And let's talk about some of the ways that omega-3 has actually been studied in human trials. So that trial was a prospective study with a questionnaire as its primary means of evaluation. This is a meta-analysis of multiple trials actually done on humans with real outcomes. So very, very different type of research model here. This was published in 2022 in Frontiers in Nutrition. And what you can see here is omega-3 fatty acid supplementation had a positive effect in reducing the incidence of MACE. MACE stands for major adverse cardiovascular events, cardiovascular death, and myocardial infarction. So it reduced major heart attacks. It reduced the risk of death. Regardless of the stage of coronary heart disease, omega-3 fatty acid supplementation can prevent the occurrence of myocardial infarction. The dose was 0.8 to 1.2 grams of omega-3 fatty acid supplementation. Again, alleviated coronary heart disease risk more effectively than lower or higher doses. So this is the range, the dose range that showed the benefit. And again, this is a study done on humans. It's actually a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials done on humans. And so I think we could put a lot more value in something like this than on a questionnaire in a prospective study, asking people to report what they're consuming and then drawing massive conclusions about danger. Let's look at another study. This was published by the DeBakey Cardiovascular Journal. And you can see 3 recent clinical trials. Again, keyword here is clinical trials. These are studies actually being done in humans, not questionnaires designed to scare you. Recent clinical trials have demonstrated the benefits of marine omega-3 fatty acids on cardiovascular disease endpoints. And so in one of the trials, the vitamin D and omega-3 trial, 840 milligrams a day of EPA, which is a type of omega-3, as well as DHA, resulted in a 28% reduced risk for heart attacks, 50% reduced risk for fatal heart attacks, and 17% reduced risk for total coronary heart disease events. In another study, the ASCEND trial, cardiovascular disease death was significantly reduced by 19% with 840 milligrams of EPA and DHA. So we've got 2 major trials and meta-analysis of trials that show tremendous benefit for the use of omega-3 and the prevention of death, heart attacks, and coronary vascular disease. Now, if we look at some of the other functions or some of the other research on omega-3, this is a study published in the journal Neurology. And so you can see in the conclusion down here, lower red blood cell DHA levels are associated with smaller brain volumes and a vascular pattern of cognitive impairment, even in persons free of clinical dementia. Now, what is dementia? Alzheimer's. Okay, Alzheimer's disease, even in people that didn't have clinical Alzheimer's or dementia, they found that when those individuals had low DHA in their blood, they had patterns in their brain, they had reduction in brain mass that looks like dementia or looks like Alzheimer's disease. So we know that omega-3 DHA is very important for forming the white matter in your brain and helping you to maintain your cognitive function and your memory. And there have been a number of human trials on memory and cognition using omega-3 fatty acids and finding them helpful and beneficial. You know, another study that I want to point out here, this one, you see healthy adults of both sexes, the data suggested that an omega-3 index of greater than 5.6% may help maintain normal red blood cell structural and functional integrity. What does that mean? So your red blood cells are shaped somewhat like this, a biconcave disc. Inside your red blood cell you have the protein structure, hemoglobin, and this is where you carry oxygen, or O2. Now the cell itself, the membrane, or the lining or the wall of the cell, which is this structure right here, if we blow that up and look at it, it looks something like this. It's what's called a bilayer or a phospholipid bilayer. So this is a Basically, it's a layer of fat that surrounds the cell. Now, part of the constituent of this fat is omega-3. And so what they're saying here is, you see here it says omega-3 index of 5.6%. They're saying that if the quantity of omega-3 in this side of this membrane is 5.6% of the total fat in that membrane, then this membrane works better, right? And so that's what it means, the structural and functional integrity of the cell. So if you have enough omega-3 in this membrane, this cell will not rupture as easily, it will not break as easily. The receptors on the surface of these cells will work more effectively. In other words, omega-3 is super important for the membrane that surrounds that red blood cell for its structural integrity and function. Because if your red blood cells, or any cell for that matter, if they break too easy, if they lyse or break too easy, then what is going to happen is we're going to end up with a type of anemia. There's a name for this called hemolytic anemia. And so now your blood cells are so weak because they don't have adequate amount of omega-3, the membrane ruptures prematurely, and you don't have enough red blood cells to carry adequate oxygen to all of your tissues in your body. This is a very important function of omega-3, and this is why omega-3 is so important. Now remember, omega-3 is an essential fat. You cannot make it. You can't synthesize it internally. You have to eat foods that contain it, or you have to supplement with it. And what I said earlier is that Americans on average get about 100 milligrams a day. The need is at least 500 milligrams a day, and we're not eating that. We're eating 20% of that amount, and so a lot of people are struggling in these areas. Now, the omega-3 index is a type of test. So if you're looking to get your omega-3 levels tested, you can ask for a test. Let's make some room here, called an omega check. Now there are several labs in the country that do this. Cleveland Heart Lab is one of the major labs that performs this type of testing. It's called an omega check. And what an omega check is it's a type of omega-3 index test. And what it's measuring is it's measuring the quantity of omega-3 fats inside the membrane, inside the wall, of the red blood cell. So the percent of omega-3 inside the red blood cell's membrane is what the omega-3 index is measuring. The standard, as I showed you a minute ago, is 5.4% is what they're looking for the functionality and for the cell membrane integrity. But some doctors are measuring omega-3 the wrong way. I want to explain. When you're measuring omega-3 in the cell membrane, what you're actually seeing is a 3 to 4 month average of omega-3 in that person's diet, contributing to either adequacy within the membrane or not. There's plasma testing, though, as well. And you can see here in this study, it's omega-3 fatty acid levels in red blood cells versus plasma, and the implications for clinical utility. So when you're asking for your doctor to measure this, you want to make sure that they're doing an omega index or an omega check, not an omega plasma. I see this happen a lot. I'll send somebody out and their doctor I'll say, I want your omegas measured and I want an omega index, and their doctor doesn't know what an omega index is, and they end up sending me back a plasma result. Now, plasma can alter or change very rapidly. It can change from day to day based on what a person eats. So it's not a very good indicator of measuring omega-3 status over time, whereas this omega-3 inside the membrane gives us a 3 to 4 month average. So this study, let's just show you the conclusion here. An acute dose of omega-3 fatty acid, okay, i.e. a meal of oily fish or a fish oil supplement taken within a day before a doctor's visit, can elevate levels of EPA and DHA in plasma, whether expressed as a percentage or a concentration, but not in red blood cell membranes. In other words, if you were to take your fish oil the morning you went to get your blood drawn, you could artificially elevate your level in your blood, and it could look normal even though maybe you were just starting to take that fish oil supplement and you really didn't have enough in your overall membrane. So it can lead to a kind of a misleading test result. So again, similar to hemoglobin A1C, which is not affected by an acute glycemic deviation. Hemoglobin A1C is a test doctors use to measure average blood sugar. Red blood cells provide a more reliable estimate of patients' chronic EPA and DHA status than does plasma. So, point being, you should have your omega levels measured. You should ignore the results of that BMJ study that used questionnaires and no real scientific validity as a means to scare people away from omega-3. And you should check your levels. If you need to supplement, if your levels are low, you should supplement. And supplementation can be in the form of a high-quality fish oil. Supplementation could also be in eating healthy, oily fish, things like salmon, cod, halibut, mackerel, tuna, anchovy, all great choices to incorporate more omega-3 into your diet. You should also be choosing grass-fed, grass-finished meats, because those are higher in omega-3. But if you're eating grain-fed beef, as an example, not much omega-3 in grain-fed beef. The fat of the animal is reflective of the diet of the animal. So if the animal's eating high omega-6 grains, not going to be much omega-3 fat in their tissue. So grass-fed, grass-finished is key. So get your levels checked. It's called an omega check. Insurance can usually cover this test if you ask your doctor for it. If your levels come back low, what is low? Now, this lab has a reference range that they've recently, a few years ago, they changed, and I want you to be aware of it because it's very misleading to most people. You're going to get a total percent of how much omega-3 is in your membrane, and that number should ideally be between 8 and 12%. If you want good protection and risk reduction from cardiovascular disease, this is a fantastic range. Now, the lab will report anything 5.5 or higher percentage-wise is fine, but if we're trying to go for optimal here, 8 to 12%. Now, this lab will further break down your EPA and your DHA. Your EPA ideally should be 2 or higher, and your DHA should be 4 or higher. So when you're looking at it, the reference range is not going to match what I'm telling you here, but again, they changed their reference range. They changed their reference range a number of years ago, and it's very misleading, and it actually, in my opinion, was the wrong move. They shouldn't have changed the reference range. The old reference range for EPA was that you needed to have 2 or higher. The new reference range is 0.2 to about 2.3. And so 0.2 is almost non-existent, and it's not a good place to be. So again, that new reference range is very misleading. 2 or higher is what you're shooting for. 4 or higher on the DHA is what you're shooting for. Now this lab will also give you back your omega-6 to 3 ratio. And it will give you back something called an AA, arachidonic acid to omega-3, or rather EPA ratio. And so you want both of these to be under 4. So if you can get these two ratios under 4, if you can get your DHA above 4, if you can get your EPA at 2 or higher, and you can have your total red blood cell percentage in your membranes to be between 8 and 12%, you're solid, you're golden. That's exactly where you want to be.